The challenge that second chairs can provide is going to be, I think, a key part. And in fact, towards the end of this, I hope we'll look at an extract from a fascinating lecture recently presented at Sandhurst, the Army's Officer Training Centre, on intelligent disobedience, which actually uses the language of resist obeying. I knew the session was running, and initially it was closed. I'm not in the army, so I couldn't get there. And just at the last minute, they were perhaps had a few spare seats, but it was too late for me to go. So I'd love to have been there, not for the lecture, and I know the content reasonably well. I'd have loved to have been there for the conversations afterwards. So, leading in a second chair. Models of leadership. I guess on a day like today, I don't really need to show you something like that. I received in my inbox late last year an occasional article on leadership, which was headed with that image. I'm glad to say, if there's one good thing that's come out of GDPR, I don't think I'll be receiving any more insights on leadership. But that's, I mean, yeah, well, I have to say, there is and I'm not kidding, there is a servant leadership version in the same style, where all these pale people are holding up the red one. It's one of the most worrying examples of leadership images I've ever seen. But what we're looking at with second chairs is, if you're talking in hierarchy, then you might say these two people behind that person in red are informal second chairs. But one of the things I'd like to suggest to you is that there may be second and third and all sorts of chairs. Someone was just telling me, who isn't here now, they were going into another session, but were saying they used to row in an 8. And as far as they were concerned, the most significant seat in an 8 was the 7th. So never mind the stroke. This person reckoned that the 7th seat was the one to lead from. So you get, so that's really what we're talking about. Churchill has already featured today, and David Sims referred to Churchill and the influence of his wife Clementine, or Clemmy. I was fascinated to discover this insight from the War Cabinet with Clement Attlee. And you've got the quote there, let me read it out to you. This is from an interim biography of Roy Jenkins in 1948. When Attlee takes the chair, cabinet meetings are businesslike and efficient. We keep to the agenda, make decisions and get away in reasonable time. When Churchill presides, nothing is decided. We listen enthralled and go home many hours later, feeling that we have been present at an historic occasion. So, can I suggest, and I'm delighted, grateful to Giles Radici, in whose book I discovered that, a group of political biographies of pairings, that if you said who was the great wartime leader, I guess most people would have voted for Churchill. And yet Attlee, in that context, clearly had an important role to play. So, maybe if you could group yourselves into 3s and 4s and do all the boring stuff, like who you are and what you do and where you come from. But I'm much more interested, I'm interested in that, don't get me wrong, but I'm also interested in whether you would describe yourself in your setting as being in a first chair role or a second chair role. So if you can do that in small groups of 3 or 4, and then we'll share them together, the outcome. Well, we'll worry about first and second chairs later, but I'm just interested in roles, job titles, and that sort of thing. So what have you heard?
We're reflecting on the fact that you were in different chairs in different contexts, actually.
Right, Thank you. So obviously, one of the, leaping ahead to the end. Thank you. So can you see where I was going? Because yeah, no, exactly. So forget what I was going to ask you, because you're clearly ahead of me.
Sorry.
No, one of the crucial things, if you look at leadership relationally, then you are almost in relational terms. You are, a leader is also a follower, and you may be in a first chair in one case and in a second chair in another case, and that sort of thing. I'm just so, is that so in terms of my other question about first and second chairs, did you find it easy to answer that, or were you actually finding, well, in this context I'm this and in that context I'm the other? What? Yeah.
I think there's that dynamic of being able to move between different chairs depending, but I also noticed for me, I spent a decade in leadership at church, therefore having positional authority. As part of a team, so quite how you define the chair, difficult to say. Now I'm a practical theologian. I'm actively avoiding positional leadership, but I'm still aware that leadership can happen in an influence sense, which is personal authority. So for me, it's not just this dynamic of where do you sit in terms of where are you relatively in an authority structure, but actually can you operate from outside of it? And personally, perhaps because of my experiences, I'm really enjoying operating outside of the positional structure.
Yeah.
Because of the freedom it gives in terms of the ability to influence, but without a lot of the pressures that come with it.
Yeah. So I'm a visiting fellow at the business school in Bristol, and on at least 2 or 3 occasions in the last decade, they've tried to get me onto the faculty. And one of the reasons I resist is that I can actually span boundaries and to be honest, do stuff I enjoy doing and not do stuff I don't want to do. Let's be honest about this.
Yeah.
But so that kind of resonates. So positioning, I have no authority there whatsoever, but kind of as a connector. That's how I often find connecting ideas and connecting people.
We were talking about that and saying it's the camping stall rather than a particular.
Okay, yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, because I'm not sure about we'll come on to it a little bit later, but the expression comes from a book published in 2005 called Leading from the Second Chair. And ever since then, it's been second chair. Now, I'm not entirely happy, but I might need to ask your permission, copyright-wise, I'd be happy leading from the second camping stool.
Well, it's the camping stall rather than talking about a situation where, because of context, you're going in with a role, but it's not a context where you have authority or are in the structure. You might have authority for that time you're in that space.
Yes.
But so I was looking at it from a local preacher who actually, most of my preaching is done in a circuit, which I've not got any connection of, rather than living there and being married to one of the ministers. So.
Yeah, which are other people in that sort of, because a local preacher, a licensed lay minister, associate pastor, reader, they have all sorts of different names in different traditions. But those are kind of classic second chair roles, certainly in church hierarchy terms.
Well, I'm not quite in that place, but I'm a retired Methodist minister who leads worship in the circuit in which I live. And in fact, now officially next year, I'm actually going to have pastoral charge of a church. So that who am I in that situation?
And where do you derive, can anyone turn up? We were having a conversation over dinner last night about just the extent to which someone can kind of turn up in a church, or indeed in any organisation, and speak apparently authoritatively. Where are they actually getting their authority, their licence from?
That's quite clear for me in my situation.
Okay. We could spend the whole day on this. Unfortunately, we've only got an hour. So, thank you for that. That's beginning to flush out some of the issues. Are there any particular ones that you want?
I mean, just very quickly, so to speak.
That's all right. You're forgiven after your camping stool. You can do what you like for the rest of it.
No, I was saying because I'm a community worker with young adults in the church.
Yeah.
But talking how you can remain in the same role, but if somebody in the structure leaves, so we've got a superintendent and a minister in our church, but at the moment the minister has just left and is being replaced this year through stationing. So the two of us, if you like, were third stalls in suddenly second
Yes.
stools, but
Yeah.
without any change happening what we're doing.
Yes. No, and that could happen. I'm on a second stool where I live in the country, and we had our minister retired, and there was a kind of 18-month period where, not formally but informally, the three of us who were licensed lay ministers were, interestingly, not by the official church, but by the people around us. They kind of saw us in that sort of role, and we had to be quite careful, especially like, you know, when people ask, you know, this has got to be misunderstood. If I can marry them, you know, the answer is no, I can't. I can actually take your funeral, but I can't marry you. You know, so it raises all sorts of interesting questions. We need to move on. Thank you for that. Although, given what you've demonstrated so far, you've probably reached the end already. But you remember I started with this model of leadership. On your handout, you've got another one alongside it, and I just want to spend a bit of time on that. In some ways, it's a rather overworked image, but it's the Rublev icon, usually used in some context to describe the social trinity. Of course, the icon itself is entitled The Hospitality of Abraham, a very, very interesting leadership point. Yeah? So the original is Abraham entertaining angels unawares. Another interesting leadership point. You can spend an entire day on this from a leadership perspective. So by a small act of hospitality, Abraham entertains angels unawares, and well, he was a bit short-sighted, Abraham, and so he. Yeah, well, it's yeah. But I personally have found this very, very helpful from a theological and leadership perspective. There's all sorts of, I don't want to, I'm not an expert on iconography to explain everything that's going on, but you may well be sort of familiar with some of the geometric shapes that's going on and the reverse perspective. Interestingly, unlike one of the examples that we saw before lunch that was a love-hate relationship with those five, this, of course, has the open side drawing us in. Another bit of leadership. See why there's just, I think there's so much going on from a leadership perspective in this. So the sort of circles, not so much actually in the icon itself, but in social teaching. Now, I've got to be very careful here at Roehampton because I have people who jump down my throat if I try and explain Catholic social teaching from the perspective of the social trinity. But the idea, and this is picking up something which actually David Sims talked about this morning, and I know David reasonably well, but I've not heard this before, the intertwining. It's kind of, is this perichoresis going on, I'm beginning to think? Intertwining, I mean, that's, you know, the perichoretic trinity, the intertwining, so that the sort of the three persons are at once sort of separate and somehow intertwined. Again, something very interesting from a leadership perspective. So I would suggest that this sort of model is much more helpful. Of course, it makes it much clearer where the first chair is. I mean, one of the great things about Rublev is it's not clear, you know, where the first, because of the geometry. To a certain extent, there's the sort of circle there. But I hope you find that type of image. There are various quotes I could give you, but let me give you this one. This is Robin Greenwood from Transforming Priesthood, published back in 1994. In the Trinitarian ecclesiology, order is not provided or imposed by a single group permanently over against another, but by the fluctuating movement in relationship of the personal participants. In the perichoretic community of love, a self-ordering process takes place in which, although individual persons will fulfill unique and necessary roles, the total ordering is achieved without any one being in a permanently subordinate position to another. So notice in that, by Robin Greenwood, the idea of emergence. He actually uses the language of complexity theory, although not explicitly, in terms of a self-ordering process. So I would suggest to you that there is more to be gained from thinking of leadership in these terms than in those. Let's just do this together. In Scripture, there are quite a few examples of second chair leaders. The book that we'll be looking at in a minute has their favourite, which I think gives away quite a lot. So, second chair leaders in Scripture. We've had one or two mentioned already today. Moses and Aaron. Yeah. Well, yeah, although, yeah, I mean, there's also, but let's just keep, some of these are the sort of, I don't want to kind of make this kind of like a Sunday school memory game, but I'd be interested, and please don't go, there are some quite interesting ones.
Any of the women apart from the Blessed Virgin?
Sorry?
Any of the women apart from the Blessed Virgin?
There's another day gone.
John the Baptist.
Was he second? So yeah. So John Baptist as. Yeah. Thank you. See, so that's quite a good example of a sort of second chair, which you could argue exists. Doesn't. Well, the first chair is. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
John the Beloved.
The beloved disciple.
John, yeah.
Say more.
Sorry.
Say more why you've chosen them.
I think because you could relate him obviously to Jesus, but even within that three, we have Peter, for Ryan is somewhat more. And I'm fascinated by the way that he clearly has an impact on the disciples, particularly in John's Gospel, where when Peter wants to know something, he asks John to ask Jesus. You know, there's a dynamic going on.
Yes.
That has to do with
Yeah. Thank you. Good. Yeah.
Joseph.
Which Joseph?
From the Pharaoh. Genesis Joseph.
Yep. So that is the one. When we come at the moment on the book, Mike Bonham and Roger Patterson's book, Leading from the Second Chair, Joseph is their favourite second chair under. Is it Pharaoh or where did Potiphar fit in? Was he? Sorry, I'm forgetting. It's a long time since I was at Sunday school.
Depends which bit of the story you're in.
Yeah.
Ah, right. Should I just say or just P?
Anybody who worked with the Apostle Paul?
Yeah. Okay. Paul plus. So think of some of them. Yeah. Okay. You've got my favourite is Sosthenes. You know, if ever you actually have to, if those who belong to a church that follow a lectionary, occasionally you get something that that sort of hits you. And I remember the time I discovered Sosthenes for the first time. And there isn't a great deal about Sosthenes, but you wonder who they were and what they contributed to. Yeah.
Because when she's doing the management of the widows and the women in need under the leadership of the men, and so that's one Peter.
Okay, yeah.
Phoebe, Lydia.
You can find quite a few. If we've got another day to spare, Martha and Mary. Which was the first chair? Which was the right? This is a conversation the students had last year, and I just kind of left them to it, really. But it's an example that it's you can't always tell. One particularly profound one, which I mentioned publicly for the first time to Sam last night, was the thief on the cross with Jesus, who said, "I'm here for a reason. You don't deserve it," and it just strikes me in that very powerful. I'm sorry, I came to this too late to include an image in the PowerPoint slide, but you might find an image of the crucifixion. And I'm not quite sure what that's saying. Were they a leader? They were certainly sending a message out as telling a story or contributing to a story.
It's interesting what was meant by Jesus when he said, "It's not for me to give you the right hand or left hand kingdom." Those positions have already been filled, and you think, is that a statement about the nature of the cross? That the people who fill that with the quite an interesting kingdom thought. Is
Yes,
that what Jesus is saying?
And is Jesus positioning himself as second chair?
We need the sort of Rublev equivalent of the crucifixion. But anyway, I'm just suggesting to you, to help you think that there are the obvious ones, but there may be some kind of less obvious ones.
Saul, David, Jonathan.
Sound like an introduction agency there, Vaughan.
I just think there are some interesting dynamics there.
Yeah, well, there's... I guess if there's one thing I'm trying to encourage, and I may not need to do it with you, it's that leadership, team, organisation, call it what you will, is often a whole lot more fluid and difficult to define than some of our organisational charts or books or diagrams would suggest. And I think that's, as we come on to the Bonham and Patterson book, one of my... It's not a criticism, it's just an observation from my perspective of understanding leadership, is that they kind of see leadership in a very neat... that's the one with the person at the front in red. It's all very neat, but life's often a bit more messy than that. So, here we go. This is the book that introduced the idea of second chair leadership, published by Josie Bass in 2005. One of the suspicion I pointed out or hinted at the beginning is that it's taken quite a long time since the publication of this book, we're now 13 years on, for it to really start having an impact, certainly in the UK. And I'm detecting some quite interesting developments over the last 2 or 3 years. And I think being invited to do this today is maybe a symptom of that. So, in terms of how long it's taken, I know that CPAS have actually been doing some work on second chair leadership recently, and I tried to find it. And when I Googled it, I couldn't find anything. But what I did find was this review of that book by Rosie Ward in 2009, saying, this isn't a brand new book, I've only just discovered it. I found it fascinating because it's the first time I've ever seen this situation explored in a book. But at the same time, it's frustrating because it's American and envisages mostly large, multi-staff churches. So the classic language of this book is the executive pastor or senior pastor, and then there'll be youth pastors and worship pastors. And do the people that do the pastoring, are they called pastoral pastors? I don't, but it is. And something else from this book, which is important, and one of the things I address later on this afternoon, is it kind of assumes a perfect first chair leader. One of the biggest challenges that come to second chairs, I would suggest, is when your first chair isn't demonstrating the sort of behaviour that you might be espousing, and indeed if you're a church, your website and everything else says about the way you work collaboratively together. The Elim have really gone quite strongly. So just last week, Tuesday the 5th of June, June is the month for conferences on second chair leadership. So I noticed Elim had a conference last year for the first time, and it seems to have settled down into an annual event where it's reflecting Elim culture. It uses. Do we have anyone from the Elim tradition here with us today? One of the best MA students we ever had at Sarum was an Elim pastor. He didn't have any O-levels, and he's now studying for a PhD. Isn't that just wonderful? Isn't that just sort of isn't that just wonderful about sort of developing later in life? It talks about we need strong leaders. I haven't shown you this, I've got it on my notes. And strong leaders need to be supported by strong second chair leaders. So the whole thing is very much geared at strength, which is something that is quite important in the Elim denomination. I'm interested, it's like, I've noticed one or two are actually, who's allowed to attend is actually quite closed. So it's only kind of second chair pastors. One of the things I would suggest, and we're running a day at Sarum next year for the first time, and we're encouraging, if you're a so-called second chair, bring your first chair along, because as we'll see, some of the key questions are actually addressed as much to the first chairs as to the second chairs.
It's interesting, the question, maybe what you're saying, the question they put on that slide slightly grates with the idea. So in the Church of England, you may have a vicar and a curate, for instance, who is being trained.
Yep.
And when we've used that terminology about the second chair, it's about developing curate's ability to take on a leadership role whilst they're not the leader. But we would definitely not talk about them being supporting the senior minister. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's I hadn't noticed that, but I had the strength thing was all about. To me, it was all playing upwards to supporting the. There are all sorts of questions which I would suggest are just kind of taken for granted in this book, rather than actually made explicit. And I would hope so. For example, the Southwark work, I'd be very interested, and I kind of hope as a result of today, we might sort of make one or two collections and pick up and share what's actually available. So when I talked about this sort of ramping up over the last 2 or 3 years, Southwark have done some work. I've been asked and already done some work in Salisbury. I've been asked to do some work in Chester next year. So it's sort of, is this just a coincidence? Is it a flavour? You know, you've got to be honest. Is it just a fad, and you know, or is there something actually going on here?
Do you recall what the flappers were in Swift's Gulliver's Travels?
No, I remember the flappers as the dancers in the 1920s or whatever, Mark. But I'm afraid my I'm fairly limited.
Not a very helpful reference, but.
Well, tell us anyway.
I'll tell you, very good. But the flappers were bureaucrats, really, in satirical view of government. And the leaders all could only speak when they had a bladder inflated. And the flappers' job was to inflate the bladder. So they actually controlled when the leaders spoke. Now the reason, so it had a tremendous power over leadership. But it just reminded me of the Methodist conference where the president presides, but you've got a bureaucrat next to you constantly whispering helpful and unhelpful, true and untrue things to you to make sure you don't put your foot wrong.
Yeah.
And it's a really strange kind of subverting the power that they use, that power to do something else.
Right, okay, which reminds me of one of the books that's on your reading list, which I think is very, very good and very interesting. And it's the book, forgive my Italian pronunciation here, Consigliere by Richard Hittner. So in the Mafia, a consigliere is an advisor. It sounds a bit like the fact, you can see where it's reminded me. So he worked for Sacchi and Sacchi and now works partly in academia. I think it's an excellent book, and it's a popular book. It's not an academic book and well written, but he uses the example, including in political terms, because I think, did he spend some time in Downing Street or something? I forget anyway. But actually, the idea of the consigliere, the advisor to the, well, in the Mafia, the mobster, the Godfather figure. And actually, I think it's possibly, is it got a subtitle like Leading from the Shadows or something? Is it? Yeah, it's not very religious, but it's, I think it's, so thank you for the Gulliver's Travel reference, which I will now go and devour next time. So what I suggest, fairly obviously, is that maybe there are some kind of important principles from this book, but not necessarily don't import the practice directly. Burnham and Patterson point out 3 paradoxes for those in second chair or camping stool positions. the first they describe it as the subordinate leader paradox, is how to take action when you are actually responsible to someone else. And that's something that's already come up here this afternoon in the context of a vacancy or something. It can happen just in the context of, someone being away. I think there are questions. This is where this nice, smooth, assumed pyramid of Bonham and Patterson kind of breaks down, because sometimes you may need to be disruptive in a second chair. You actually might need to say, to take action, even if someone else is responsible, if you're not actually satisfied with what they're doing, or the whole organisation isn't, then there are interesting questions, obviously questions of whistleblowing and the rest of it.
Within a hierarchy, I found that one really helpful. I was writing about Thomas Cranmer under Henry VIII.
Okay.
Because he's in that kind of second chair role, because he's got Cromwell and Henry telling him what he can and cannot do. But he finds some really creative wriggle room within all of that incredibly hierarchical structure.
Excellent.
So I found it a really useful lens, actually. How Cranmer subverts that. I think he's a interesting leader.
Yeah, thank you. Gosh. You see it's us? So we got Churchill and Attlee, and we got Henry VIII. Oh gosh, how on earth do I do a Roman 8? Like 1, 2, 3.
Yes.
Thank you. Had you encountered the second chair idea before looking at Cranmer?
The person who was supervising my bit of work said you might find this interesting, and I did.
Good, excellent, thank you. That's a completely new one to me. That's what's wonderful about days like today, is you pick up some Gulliver's Travels and Cranmer. Bonham and Patterson refer to the deep wide. This is I think this you see in business and organisations and charities quite a lot, is you might be responsible for a department, a silo, finance, operations, marketing, but typically you also have, certainly at board level, you'll have a responsibility across the organisation. And again, I'm not sure this is actually limited to second chair leaders, the contentment dreaming. You need to work where you are, which is a kind of fairly incarnational point to make. But that you actually will be nurturing dreams. If the implication here is that it's the first chair leader who's responsible for the vision, I actually find that a little bit worrying personally. But I don't want to read, without going back to the book and checking, I wouldn't want to read that into it. Okay, so does that give you some of the flavour? Okay, just one or two things about first and second chairs are unlikely to exist just independent of anyone else. And in fact, it was the Churchill and Attlee reference that reminded me. I mean, Belbin hadn't been invented. Dr. Belbin was probably a young lad during the Second World War. But are you sort of familiar? You don't need to know the details. Are you familiar with the idea of the Belbin team preferences? I think he describes it quite carefully. Academically hard to prove, but very helpful, I would suggest, in practical terms. So you've got the. I mean, is the chair actually? I'm not sure it's a role. There's a coordinator role, isn't there, in Belbin? There isn't an actual chair, but the way that Attlee sort of carried forward decision making, whereas Churchill was a classic. I think would probably be a plant in Belbin terms. I remember poor old TSB and all their problems with their IT systems. It reminded me, and preparing this reminded me of a time back in the mid-90s when I was working in a quite senior position in a company where the entire network went down, and we had about 10,000 employees, and the entire company ground to a halt for a period of about 24 hours. And we had all sorts of emergency meetings, and the IT director convened an emergency meeting, and I was part of this team saying, what are we going to do about it? And almost the very first thing he said was something along the lines of, have you seen this latest gizmo that IBM, or it would have been Cisco or whatever, have come about, fourth generation, sort of networks? And you want to say, Mike, we've got 10,000 people who can't do any work. We've actually got to fix that problem before, and that's a classic. And interestingly, there is a link there, because partly as a result of that row, actually he handed over the chairing of our management meetings to his deputy, who was an absolutely solid person who would say, we got the bloody problem, and so I'm not sure I knew about Belbin in those days, but it does show, in terms of, I guess, context-based leadership and strengths in particular areas. So,
Belbin reference to a northerner.
sorry, I think academics would say there's as much rigour in a northerner, southerner thing as into some of the Belbin preferences, but yeah. Something else that it makes me think of is the Ephesians 4 framework, which you may know through the catchy APEST. What's the word for? What's not an acronym? Thank you. Acronym. So Ephesians 4, apostles, prophets, evangelists. So in the early work by Alan Hirsch, it was the APEPT framework, where pastors, but APEST sounds much better, so he changed pastors to shepherds, and it became the APEST framework. I think the point that I would make here, and this is something again that has come up today, is actually the role of the prophet. One of the things that Belbin doesn't have is what you might describe as the court jester. The wise fool, the holy fool, often featuring in Shakespeare's plays and the rest of it, to reflect back the absurdity of what someone has just said or what a situation is looking like. And these people are kind of a bit annoying. I would suggest ecologically, disturbance is crucial to a living system. And I would suggest, however annoying they are, the prophets, the people who really irritate us, actually need to be heard, because that is contributing to the health of the system. So you've got different ways of beginning to sort of frame the first and second chairs in a wider context. Something that can't be ignored, which is, I'm glad to say, has already actually begun to come up, so thank you for that, is where are people getting their power from? A critical management scholar would say, ignore all that. What power structures are in place here? Where's the voice of the unheard? Stuff that I'm glad to say we've actually been hearing today. So, and that raises questions of governance and ecclesiology and the rest of it in a church context. Where does the power lie? Whatever's spoken, what's really going on? Right, we've got time. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to play you the video clips, but never mind. You've got hyperlinks in the handout. But right, this comes from heart surgery, cardiac surgery, and I think it's a very good example of the role of the first chair leader in cultivating second chair responsibility and trust. So to give you've got the handout. So on that handout, you've got this diagram. This comes from an article by Amy Edmondson and colleagues in the Harvard Business Review. Studied at the time of introduction of non-invasive techniques into cardiac surgery. And what Edmondson and the team were looking at was how long it took teams presented with the new techniques to reduce they were obviously much slower to begin with. And the manufacturers, you can read the detail there, the manufacturers claim that you'd be back up to speed in about 8 operations or something like that. In fact, it took much longer. What this diagram here, the yellow line says this is the time, so the elapsed time has come down on average from 6 hours to about 4.5 hours after, this is a touch screen. Wow. With that, so how do I go backwards? So it's gone down from 6 to about 4.5 hours on average. She highlights, these are just anonymous names of the hospitals, this hospital Chelsea, which performs fairly close to the average, and this one Mountain, which is one of the ones that actually gets used to the new technology much better. one of my all-time favourite quotes comes from the lead surgeon. You've got it there on Chelsea. The team was led by a renowned cardiac surgeon with considerable experience of new technology. It was not a matter of training myself, they are reported as saying. It was a matter of training the team. After almost 50 procedures, the surgeon commented, "It doesn't seem to be getting that much better." Right. Whereas the Mountain team, led by a relatively junior surgeon keen to try new technology, they commented, the ability of the surgeon to allow himself, which was the language they used, the ability of the surgeon to allow himself to become a partner, not a dictator, is crucial. And there are some very interesting examples in the study of how, by demonstrating, interestingly, vulnerability, the heart surgeons were able to get better outcomes. So a couple of examples that Amy Edmondson quotes. Firstly is one of the surgeons actually says, "This is new to me, I might make a mistake. If you see me about to make a mistake, please stop me." That's quite something, given the hierarchical, world of and renown in which heart surgeons are well, any profession are held. So admitting you're going to make it's not very close to the strong leader who knows everything, is it? And secondly, there's a very interesting example which is described in frankly more detail than I'd like to know, given my aversion to blood, where one of the operations went horribly wrong, and one of the scrub nurse, who's one of the junior members of the team, actually said, "You know those old-fashioned metal clamps we used to use to staunch blood flows, which are now down in the basement somewhere? I think that's the best way of actually immediately staunching the flow." And if you think of the confidence that it takes to say, it's not only is it a junior person, they're actually saying, let's go back to the old technology, because they're all on the kind of new stuff. And Amy Edmondson uses she's the one who's associated with the expression zones of psychological safety. And she, by her observation, she comes up with this list of 8 or 9 behaviours that she notices. And I think these are highly relevant. I'm talking now primarily about first chair leaders, but it's bringing on second chair leaders. So some of it's fairly straightforward, accessible and approachable, acknowledging limits of current knowledge. This is where it gets really interesting. Willing to display fallibility, I might make a mistake. If you see me about to make a mistake, please tell me. Invite participation. Highlight failure as learning opportunities. She actually uses, a lot of this is couched in terms of team and organisational learning, that it actually flows from the behaviours of the teams together. Language, interesting language features, I talked about the planes falling out of the sky. That's actually one of the areas that's been highlighted, that different languages in different culture use some where you say something, suggesting something, where you actually mean bloody well go ahead and do it. And the action of actually, there's certainly one, I think it was one of the New York airports where a plane that was in a hold pattern ran out of fuel, and that was perceived as being a communication problem between the people on the plane saying we're about to run out of fuel, and the control tower saying just go round for one more time. Boundaries, again, some of this would be fairly familiar to you. And this is the actual word she uses: hold people accountable for their transgressions. Whether there is a short service of absolution following each operation, I don't know. But it's not that, display fallibility, make mistakes, but it's not ignore the mistakes, it's actually learn from them. And so that, I suggest, leads to a culture of trust. And for those of you, are you familiar with Patrick Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team? It's kind of written in an annoying style, and I'm going to give you a plot spoiler. So it's written. The book is kind of written, and it's, although it's written for the business market, it's used quite widely in churches. So Lencioni drills down. So he starts with the kind of surface manifestations, which is things like inattention to results. And then he drills his way down to say the real problem is there's a lack of trust, there's an absence of trust. So in fact, I was interested, actually having seen him present this recently, he now actually starts, he just says, look, it's trust. Without trust, the rest of it is actually just getting to the trust. So I would suggest that this type of behaviour cultivates a culture of trust. So just to finish, this is where, if you want to see this Chalef speaking at Sandhurst, there is a link on the. It would be ideal to get an electronic copy of that rather than trying to get that whole link. There are, in fact, let me just show. There are two. I find this. I first came across constructive dissent about 12 or 15 years ago. I heard about it. I was in Windsor Castle, in St George's House at Windsor Castle, listening to a marshal of the RAF, who now has a knighthood. Okay, so this is kind of established. In terms of radical thinking, I wasn't expecting radical thinking, and this air marshal started talking about constructive dissent, and I was blown away by it. It was observed by Keith Grint that David Sims referred to this morning. Keith Grint took part in an RAF training course, and one of the things he was observing what was kind of going on, and one of the things he noticed was what he referred to as constructive dissent. So typically the instructor would say, and if it was about how to repair an aircraft or something, the instructor would say, you take this washer off and then you do that. And then one of the class, who was junior to the instructor, would say, forgive, having tried my northern accent, I won't even try it, but basically, oi Sarge, I know it says that in the manual, but what we do is we do it this way and we do it the other, and so it's actually, what he noticed was that again, it's back to the Amy Edmondson learning in cardiac surgery. It's contributing to group learning by using dissent. Of course, the interesting bit is you don't get to dissent on the battlefield. So the RAF, but this is where the latest thinking from Sandhurst is really interesting, because what the RAF said is in today's, they tend to use the language of asymmetric warfare. The world was much more stable in the days of the good old Warsaw Pact, where everyone knew what was going on. We train our people like hell. We give them a mission command, go and occupy that hill, get that airfield. How they do it and how they react to whatever they encounter is down to their training. So constructive dissent builds into the training, but once you're on the battlefield, if someone says shoot, you shoot. What Ira Chalef said at Sandhurst a few weeks ago, and I quote, is resist obeying. That's why I'd love to have been there to know. Now, interestingly, the army were terribly dismissive about constructive dissent. So I once, soon after I'd encountered constructive dissent, I remember at a conference a bit like this, telling someone that I didn't know about constructive dissent and how fascinating I found it. And this bloke was going redder and redder and redder. You know how cartoon characters sort of sweat, pour, he was just going like this. And he eventually went bang. And I discovered later he was a retired general. And of course I had been challenging his entire worldview, because he, as an old general, issued instructions and people. So it's very interesting that 12 or 15 years on, possibly as a result of experience in all sorts of battlefields, which may be cyber fields or certainly a long way from the good old Warsaw Pact, that Ira Chalef is now talking about the importance of intelligent disobedience. He's got to it from work he's done with the American Association of Guide Dogs for the Blind, where guide dogs are actually taught to, the sort of example is, which is in a way quite trivial, is if there's a hole in the, if there's a hole in the road or pavement, or the traffic lights have gone wrong and you think it's safe to cross and it isn't. But I didn't realise the dogs are actually trained to give an extra tug the other way. So if and there was Chalef at Sandhurst saying if someone asks you, or tells you to do the wrong thing, give them a counter-pull, I think he called it. So that's why I'd love to have been there. And I think when you get into this kind of territory, we're a long, long way from the Bonham and Patterson, nice, neat, the leader knows best, and it's all a nice sort of hierarchy with things flowing down. I've already made the point about conflict. And then two other ones just to introduce you to if you're not familiar with. Again, this is Keith Grint from the same experience with the RAF, what he refers to as inverse learning. And he makes the point that anyone who's ever been a parent will know how they learn from their children. And that, again, notice it's all around the context of group learning. Reverse mentoring. Earl Krebs, again, this is a book published in a church context. Anyone into reverse mentoring around here? Reverse mentoring, classic. I used to have, it wasn't a formal arrangement, but until 2 or 3 years ago, there was a young bloke I knew who was in his late 20s who thought about the world in a totally different way to me. And I actually would try and have a long coffee with him about every few months just to try to find out how he's thinking. And what you'll find if you look, and there's an interesting clip from the Wall Street Journal, I think, on your bibliography. It started off with technology, and that senior people in companies didn't know about social media and smartphones and tablets. That has almost been solved. What's much more interesting in the context of reverse mentoring now is actually getting to know how millennials think. So the clip from the Wall Street, if it is the Wall Street Journal, if you watch it, stay to the end, because the first bit is it's from MasterCard, and it's the kind of global director of something in MasterCard with a student who's just joined MasterCard. And she's telling him about, how to do a blog and tweet and stuff. But towards the last 30 seconds, she starts saying, you're very corporate. All you ever tweet about is MasterCard's corporate position on something. What about discovering something about you as a person? You see, it's actually beginning to understand how different people think. So there we go. A final reflection to leave you with, which you can take away. Reflect on a recent occasion when you experienced a second chair scenario, either as the first or second. What expectations were being revealed? How did you react? How might you react differently in future? What conversations might help share the learning?